The slap echoed across the marble lobby, sharp and public. Evelyn Harrington steadied herself, her cheek burning, the weight of the banker's hand still fresh against her skin, her cash scattered across the polished floor like debris. Jason Reed stood over her, his face twisted in anger, too sure that no one would question him. Security closed in. Police were called. No questions were asked. To them, she was just another problem to be removed. But Evelyn Harrington was not a woman they could silence. She was the power behind the bank's greatest fortunes, the hand that fed them without them ever realizing it. And when she moved against them, she would not just destroy careers, she would bring the walls down with her. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering glass panels of Weston Bank's flagship downtown branch, casting long, angled beams across the polished marble floor, where customers shuffled in and out in neat lines. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and fresh paper, the quiet hum of commerce wrapping the grand lobby in a shallow kind of importance that barely skimmed the surface of its daily transactions. Beneath the gold-leaf signage and gleaming countertops, however, there was an undercurrent, a colder, sharper edge that revealed itself not in the design of the space, but in the small ways the staff carried themselves. It lingered in the clipped greetings, the quick glances, the way some customers were ushered forward while others waited just a little longer without ever being told why. Evelyn Harrington felt the weight of it the moment she stepped through the glass doors. Dressed in an understated navy pantsuit, a soft cream blouse buttoned neatly to the collar, she carried herself with the easy confidence of a woman accustomed to moving through boardrooms, courtrooms, and corner offices without fanfare. In one hand, she held a slim leather bag, worn but well kept, containing a deposit that would, by itself, outsize most of the bank's daily activity. She did not hurry. Her low heels clicked steadily against the floor as she made her way toward the open counter where a handful of bankers waited behind wide, impersonal desks, tapping at keyboards and offering rehearsed smiles to customers whose names they would never remember. She paused politely in front of one such desk where a young man, no older than his late 20s, sat hunched over his monitor. His badge read Jason Reed, and he did not look up right away. Evelyn cleared her throat gently, offering a warm, measured greeting. Jason's head lifted then, and for a moment his gaze skated over her. From her graying hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, to the dark tone of her skin, to the leather bag resting comfortably in her hand, something subtle hardened in his expression. "Can I help you?" he asked, the words shaped more like a challenge than a service. Evelyn smiled faintly, accustomed to this tone, though it still stirred something old and bitter inside her. She laid the bag gently on the desk, careful not to startle him, and produced her identification along with a completed deposit slip. "I'm here to make a company deposit," she said simply. "It's a large amount. Everything is prepared." Jason glanced at the ID without touching it, his mouth pressed into a tight line. "What company?" he asked. "Harrington Global Holdings," Evelyn replied, her voice even. Jason leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his arms. "Never heard of it," he said. His eyes flicked to the bag again, suspicion sharpening. "You understand that we have protocols about large cash deposits? You can't just walk in off the street with a bag of money." "I understand perfectly," Evelyn said, still calm. "This is a corporate deposit. You can verify the account. All documentation is provided." Jason didn't move. He didn't even reach for the ID that lay on the desk between them, pristine and untouched. Instead, he stared at her for a long, pointed moment, making no effort to hide the skepticism twisting his face. Evelyn could feel the gazes of other customers and tellers beginning to drift toward them, drawn by the slight but unmistakable shift in the air. "You're going to need to leave," Jason said finally, his voice louder now, carrying easily across the lobby. "We don't accept suspicious transactions like this without prior appointment." Evelyn blinked once, slowly. "Sir, I am a long-standing corporate client of this bank," she said, keeping her tone steady. "All of this can be verified in less than a minute if you'll simply check the account." "I don't have to check anything," Jason snapped, his cheeks coloring. "You're not authorized for this branch. You people think you can just show up anywhere and expect us to look the other way?" For the first time, a flicker of something colder passed behind Evelyn's eyes. She remained rooted in place, refusing to allow the humiliation he intended. "I would strongly suggest you verify my credentials before making accusations," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the growing tension with the precision of a scalpel. Jason scoffed, loudly enough that several heads turned. "Security's going to escort you out if you don't leave," he said. "Last warning." Evelyn leaned in slightly, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "If you do this, you will regret it." Jason sat back, folding his arms across his chest with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, a grin that said he thought he was in control, that he thought she was bluffing, that he thought she was just another problem to be dismissed without consequence. Around them, the lobby buzzed faintly, a few tellers whispering nervously to each other behind the glass partitions, but nobody moved to intervene. The bank manager, Martin Glass, stood at a distance, pretending to be absorbed in paperwork, his peripheral vision keenly tracking every word, every gesture, every brewing consequence he would later claim he never saw coming. And Evelyn, standing firm in the center of it all, felt the old, familiar coil of injustice tightening in her chest. Not from fear, not from surprise, but from the quiet, infuriating knowledge that this was the cost of simply existing in spaces built to exclude her. Yet she made no move to back down. Not yet. Not when the storm was just beginning to gather. She stood still, waiting, letting the silence stretch between them, daring Jason Reed to take the next step, the wrong step, without realizing how much it would cost him. The silence between them stretched thinner with every passing second, the edges sharp enough to cut. Evelyn did not move, did not lower her gaze, did not shrink herself to make him more comfortable. She stood calmly, her identification still resting between them like a forgotten offering that Jason Reed had no intention of accepting. Around them, the life of the bank continued in uneasy, fragmented pieces. The low clatter of keyboards, the rustle of paper, the occasional forced cough, but the center of gravity in the room had shifted here. To this standoff, neither could now pretend was just business as usual. Jason's posture stiffened. He leaned forward, his voice dipping low, the words coated with disdain. "You people think you can just walk in here waving some papers around, flashing some ID, and expect to be treated like you're legitimate." His eyes flickered down to her bag again, his lip curling slightly. "I've seen enough scams to know how this works." Evelyn inhaled slowly, feeling the quiet burn of humiliation creep up the back of her neck, the kind that came not from any truth in his words, but from the sick, heavy knowledge that they were a script he had already decided she would play. She chose her next words carefully, weighing each one like a stone in her hand. "You are making an assumption based solely on how I look," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You have not checked my identification. You have not verified the account information I provided. You are profiling me, not doing your job." Jason gave a short, humorless laugh and pushed himself up from his chair, standing now so that he could loom slightly over her. "Profiling?" he repeated mockingly. "You're the one showing up here with a bag of cash. You're lucky I don't call the police right now." Evelyn lifted her chin, refusing to let him bait her into an emotional reaction. "Then call them," she said evenly. "Let them verify what you refuse to." The words hit harder than she'd intended, or perhaps exactly as she'd intended, because Jason's face darkened, the blood rushing to his cheeks, his hand balling briefly into a fist before he forced it flat against the desk. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone he had already decided was beneath him, not by someone he thought he could humiliate without consequence. Martin Glass, the branch manager, shifted uneasily in the distance, but did not approach, his cowardice as thick and obvious as the tension now knotting the lobby into silence. "You think you're better than me?" Jason hissed under his breath, his voice laced with something uglier now, something that had always been there under the surface, waiting for an excuse. "Coming in here dressed up, pretending to be something you're not? I know your type. Think some fancy clothes are gonna hide it?" Evelyn did not flinch, though she felt the anger coil tighter inside her with every word. "The only thing you know is your own prejudice," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the poisonous air between them. "And today, it's going to cost you." Jason sneered. "You don't scare me, lady. You think anyone's gonna believe some loudmouth troublemaker over a bank employee? You're nothing here. Nothing." The bag of cash still sat on the desk between them, an unspoken accusation, but neither of them looked at it now. All the ugliness had boiled to the surface, raw and unfiltered, and Evelyn knew, with a certainty as cold as steel, that nothing she said could unwind it. This wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about security. It was about the story he had already written in his head the moment she had walked through the door. Security guards began drifting closer, summoned not by any real disturbance, but by the heat of Jason's raised voice, by the expectation, so often and so easily fulfilled, that it would be someone like her causing the problem. Evelyn could see it in their eyes already. They were not approaching to ask questions. They were approaching to remove her. Jason smirked, sensing the shift, mistaking it for victory. "You're gonna leave, one way or another," he said, stepping out from behind the desk now, closing the space between them. "You don't belong here." Evelyn's heart pounded steadily in her chest, not with fear, but with the slow, relentless pulse of fury contained. She had spent a lifetime mastering it, burying it beneath professionalism and patience, knowing that too many saw even a whisper of anger from her as justification for violence. She drew a slow breath, anchoring herself, refusing to give him what he wanted. "I am not leaving," she said, voice clear and firm enough to carry across the floor. "You will either process my deposit properly, or you will make the mistake of escalating this further." The security guards hesitated, uncertain now, caught between Jason's escalating aggression and the calm, undeniable authority in Evelyn's voice. For a moment, the entire lobby seemed to hang in that space, teetering between decency and disaster. Jason chose disaster. He took another step forward, his hand twitching at his side, the sneer on his face deepening as he barked over his shoulder. "Get her out of here now, before she causes a scene!" The irony of his words was not lost on Evelyn as the guards closed in around her, their faces set in the rigid, unquestioning expressions of men trained to follow orders, not to ask whether they were just. And still, she stood her ground, her body rooted firmly to the polished marble beneath her, refusing to be bullied, refusing to be erased. And though Jason Reed had already crossed several lines, he was not finished yet, not by a long shot. The hum of the lobby dimmed to a dull roar in Evelyn's ears as the security guards closed in, the world narrowing to the taut, electric space between herself and Jason Reed. She watched his hands, the way they twitched slightly with suppressed anger, the way his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle jumped in his cheek. He was unraveling, not because she had shouted, not because she had made any threat, but because she had refused to cower, refused to play the part he had decided for her the moment their eyes met. "Move," Jason snapped, his voice cracking slightly under the strain of holding himself together. "Now." Evelyn stood as still as stone, meeting his glare with an unblinking steadiness that only enraged him further. Around them, the lobby's scattered conversations died off entirely. Phones were lowered. Tellers froze in mid-transaction. Even the guards hesitated, suddenly unsure whether they were witnessing a disturbance or becoming part of one. Jason's face twisted into something meaner, smaller, as if all the ugly, festering things he had carried in his heart had finally clawed their way to the surface. He took another step forward, standing almost chest to chest with her now, his breath sharp and uneven. "You think you're better than everyone else," he spat, his voice loud enough for every person in the lobby to hear. "You think you can come in here, flaunting your money, acting like you're important? You're nothing. You're just another." He stopped just short of a word he couldn't quite get out. But the meaning was already there, thick in the air between them. Evelyn's expression didn't flinch. She stepped in closer, her voice cutting so sharply that it stripped the false confidence from his face before he could react. "No," she said softly, but unmistakably. "You're the nothing here, a small, scared little man hiding behind a cheap suit and a plastic badge, desperate for a sliver of authority because deep down you know you will never have real power, real respect." Jason's nostrils flared, the muscles in his face pulling tight, as though each word physically struck him harder than a closed fist could have. "You think you're important because you sit behind a desk someone else gave you. You think you can humiliate people to forget how pathetic you are. But you are nothing but a coward with a title," Evelyn said, the words precise, deliberate, each one landing with a sharp, audible weight. "And no matter how loud you scream, no matter how many people you bully, you will still wake up every morning knowing you're small. You'll still go home every night and stare at yourself in the mirror and see exactly what you are." The color drained from Jason's face, only to come rushing back in a violent flood of red that crawled up his neck and burned in his ears. Around them, the silence thickened to the point of suffocation. The guards hovered uncertainly at the edges, instinctively recognizing that something had shifted, but too dull to understand it fully. Jason Reed, whose world had always tilted toward his favor, who had always counted on people folding, on people lowering their heads to make his seem higher, finally, truly snapped. Without thinking, without hesitation, he raised his hand and struck Evelyn full across the face. The sound cracked through the lobby like a gunshot, startling even the guards who had been poised to grab her. Evelyn's head jerked sharply to the side under the force of it, her body swaying but not falling, her balance rooted in something far deeper than physical strength. A sharp, searing pain bloomed across her cheek, but she did not lift her hand to it, did not stumble back or cry out. She straightened slowly, deliberately, and turned her gaze back to him with a calm, cutting clarity that stripped the last shreds of self-justification from his face. Gasps rippled through the lobby, sharp, quick, involuntary. Some customers recoiled. Others simply stood frozen in place, unable to look away. No one moved. No one helped. They only watched, bearing silent witness to a humiliation so raw and so public that even Jason seemed momentarily stunned by what he had done. But the momentary hesitation passed quickly. Jason, breathing hard, realized the thin line he had crossed and did what men like him always did: doubled down. "Get her out of here," he barked, his voice cracking at the edges, but trying desperately to cling to authority. "Now! She assaulted me! She caused a scene!" The guards, jolted into action by his scream rather than by the truth, lunged forward. They seized Evelyn roughly by the arms, twisting them behind her back, with enough force to draw a sharp, involuntary wince from her lips, though she swallowed the sound before it could betray her dignity. She said nothing. She gave them nothing. Her leather bag slipped from her hand, hitting the polished marble with a dull thud as the clasp broke open, and cash spilled across the floor like an accusation neither of them could deny. Bills fluttered and scattered, spinning in lazy circles under the lobby's ceiling fans. The bright, unmistakable proof of her legitimacy now twisted into the visual of a criminal's loot. Jason pointed at the scattered money, shouting over the rising buzz of whispers and clicking phone cameras, "Proof she's dirty! Look at this! She's trying to scam the bank!" The security guards, seeing only what they wanted to see, tightened their grip and began hauling Evelyn toward the entrance, dragging her through the silent, horrified crowd. Evelyn did not struggle. Her feet moved of their own accord, each step heavy, measured, the fire in her cheek matched only by the steel settling deeper into her spine. Outside, the flashing blue lights of a police cruiser painted the sidewalk in cold, stuttering bursts of color. Two officers, already called by Jason's earlier lies, stepped out and surveyed the scene with lazy, disinterested eyes that spoke volumes about what they thought they were walking into. Jason rushed ahead to meet them, still vibrating with the giddy, desperate energy of a man who believed he had secured victory through violence. "She caused a disturbance," he shouted. "She threatened me, assaulted me. We had to restrain her." The officers did not ask for evidence. They did not ask for identification. They did not look at the cash on the ground, or the surveillance cameras blinking silently in the corners of the lobby, or the trembling mouths of the witnesses who said nothing. They moved straight toward Evelyn, their hands already reaching for their cuffs, their minds already closed. Without a word, they seized her, twisting her sore arms further behind her back, locking cold steel around her wrists with a brutal efficiency that said they had done this many times before, and never to anyone they truly saw. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser with as little ceremony as one might use on a broken chair, left for the trash. No rights read, no questions asked, no hesitation, just the practiced, mechanical cruelty of a system built to silence before it listens. Inside the cruiser, the door slammed, sealing Evelyn into a box of stale air and thicker injustice. She leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the raw heat of the slap still pulsing in her cheek, but she let none of it touch her face. Her expression remained as smooth and unbroken as polished stone. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath, knowing that this moment of humiliation, of silence, of invisible suffering, would not be the end. It would be the beginning. And when she moved, when she answered this outrage, the ground beneath every man who had touched her today would crack wide open. The cell smelled of cold concrete and disinfectant, a sterile, hollow scent that clung to the air and soaked into the skin. The bench along the back wall was little more than a slab of rough metal bolted to the stone, and when Evelyn sat down, the chill of it seeped through the fabric of her slacks and into her bones. She didn't shift or fidget. She placed her hands neatly in her lap, the raw discomfort of the handcuffs a background noise she pushed into the far corners of her mind. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, flickering every few seconds, casting harsh shadows across the floor in a pattern that stretched and snapped like an elastic band pulled too tight. Hours passed in the kind of slow, grinding way that made it impossible to tell whether it was morning or night beyond the narrow, grimy window high on the wall. Officers came and went, some pausing at the barred door to glance at her with curiosity or disdain, before moving on without a word. No one offered her water. No one asked her name. She remained invisible in the most visible way possible, a fixture in their system, expected to sit and rot quietly until someone remembered why she was there. Evelyn leaned her head back against the cold wall and closed her eyes, letting the ache in her wrists and the sting in her cheek settle into the background. She had learned long ago that there were battles you fought with words, battles you fought with force, and battles you fought by simply surviving long enough to choose the ground on which the real war would be waged. Today was not the day for raised voices or broken fists. Today was the day for patience. In another part of the city, the world was moving without her, but not without notice. Clarissa James, her longtime legal counsel and trusted advisor, frowned as she tapped her foot against the gleaming floor of Harrington Global's downtown headquarters. She had been trying to reach Evelyn for hours. First polite calls, then urgent messages, then increasingly sharp emails sent to every device Evelyn owned. No response, no check-ins, nothing. It was not just unusual, it was unheard of. Clarissa pulled up the company's security protocols, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she initiated the first stages of the missing executive protocol they had designed years ago but never expected to use. Within 15 minutes, security staff from the building had reviewed traffic cams near Weston Bank, pieced together Evelyn's movements, and flagged the police dispatch call logs. Within 30 minutes, Clarissa had in her possession a copy of the call placed by Jason Reed, distorted by static but clear enough to make her stomach twist into a tight, furious knot. She reached for her phone without hesitation, her voice a low, tight snarl as she dialed the emergency line set aside for the firm's private attorneys. Orders were given. Subpoenas were drafted. Requests for security footage were filed and stamped before most people would have realized anything was wrong. Evelyn's silence had spoken more loudly than any call for help could have. At the same time, in Harrington Global's executive boardroom, a different kind of storm was gathering. Charles Edmonds, the firm's chief operating officer, flipped through a copy of the morning's balance sheets, frowning as he read the internal memo flashing red across the top of his tablet. CEO unreachable. Potential legal emergency. Initiate asset review. The financial division moved like a machine built for war, contacting the bank's corporate relations team with cool, clipped professionalism. Questions were asked in formal tones, each one precise and documented. Answers were either fumbling or suspiciously absent, prompting the first quiet preparations for a withdrawal that would leave the bank gasping for air. It was not a decision made out of anger. It was not even made out of loyalty. It was made because Evelyn Harrington's name was etched into every contract, every operating agreement, every expansion strategy that had allowed the firm to amass hundreds of millions in assets under Weston Bank's roof. If Evelyn was disrespected, then, by extension, every dollar tied to her was at risk. Corporate loyalty did not run on emotion. It ran on survival. Back in the holding cell, Evelyn allowed herself to drift behind closed eyelids, resting but not sleeping, her mind ticking steadily forward even as her body sat motionless. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that dignity was not something you begged for. It was something you carried, even when no one else could see it. She thought of every deal she had closed, every boardroom she had conquered, every time she had stood in a room full of men who expected her to fail and left them counting losses they hadn't even seen coming. The metallic clatter of keys against the bars drew her attention, but she did not move immediately. She opened her eyes slowly, calmly, and watched as a deputy approached, fumbling with the lock, his mouth set in a tight line, as if already preparing excuses he would later tell himself to feel better about what was happening. "You're being processed for release," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the mistake. Evelyn rose without a word, every movement deliberate and steady, as if daring the walls themselves to remember the shape of her dignity. She stepped out of the cell and into the fluorescent-lit corridor, her wrists raw and burning as the cuffs were finally removed. She did not thank the deputy. She did not glance back. She simply walked, each step measured, her silence an indictment heavier than any accusation they could have thrown at her. Outside the station, the air was thick and warm, buzzing faintly with the sounds of the city moving on, without any awareness of the injustice carried quietly through its streets. Evelyn stood still for a moment, her bag gone, her documents misplaced, her body bruised and aching, but her mind was a blade honed sharper than ever. She knew what would come next, and it would be theirs to answer for, every last one of them. The late afternoon sun washed harsh and golden across the city as Evelyn stepped back onto Weston Bank's marble floor, this time with Clarissa James flanking her like a silent blade at her side. Her face was calm, composed, the faint swelling on her cheek now a dark bruising mark that stood out starkly against her skin. She wore no armor except her presence, but the shift in the air was immediate, like a storm cloud pressing low against the glass walls. Every head in the lobby turned toward her, some in recognition, some in dawning horror. Jason Reed was still there, pacing near his desk, a nervous, jittery energy radiating off him in waves. His smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped grimace that barely masked the panic clawing at the edges of his composure. When he saw her walk through the doors, he froze for half a second before hastily straightening, as if good posture could undo the violence he had already committed. Evelyn's heels clicked steadily against the marble as she crossed the lobby, her every step slow and deliberate. Clarissa said nothing. She didn't need to. Evelyn had made it clear. This would not be handled by lawyers from a distance. She would confront them herself first, standing on the same ground where they had tried to humiliate her. Jason opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to bluster, to threaten, but Evelyn cut him off with a glance sharp enough to stop him cold. She stopped a few feet from his desk, standing so that the entire room could see, the entire room could hear. "You," she said, her voice clear and low, slicing through the brittle silence like a blade. "You assaulted me. You slandered me. You had me dragged from this building like a criminal without checking a single piece of evidence placed in front of you." Jason swallowed visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing once, but said nothing. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice steady, dangerous in its restraint. "You made me a spectacle in front of your staff, your customers, your security. You called the police on me. You lied to them. You let them take me away in handcuffs because it was easier than admitting you were wrong." Jason's hand twitched at his side, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out again, but the weight of the room crushed that impulse flat. Everyone was watching now, not with curiosity, but with the uneasy, guilty gaze of people who realized too late that they had stood on the wrong side of something that could not be undone. Martin Glass, the branch manager, came scuttling forward from the back offices, his smile brittle and false. "Ms. Harrington, please, let's not escalate things further. We can sit down privately? Work this out." Evelyn turned her gaze on him, and Martin flinched like a man facing down a sword rather than a woman barely raising her voice. "You stood there," she said, not shouting, not needing to. "You saw what happened. You let it happen. And now you want to hide it behind closed doors." Martin's mouth opened and closed uselessly, the words fleeing before they could reach his tongue. Clarissa stepped forward then, unslinging the leather briefcase from her shoulder and pulling out the heavy envelope that thudded softly onto Jason's desk. "This is a subpoena," she said crisply, her voice sharp enough to make Jason jerk backward a half step. "We are seizing all security footage from today's events. Every camera angle, every second." Jason looked wildly around for support, but no one moved. Martin shifted his weight, sweat already darkening the collar of his dress shirt, but he offered no help. "And," Clarissa added, her eyes narrowing slightly, "any attempt to delete, alter, or obstruct this footage will result in immediate criminal charges. For everyone involved." Evelyn's gaze didn't leave Jason's face. She studied him, calm and unblinking, letting the silence stretch until his hands fidgeted uselessly at his sides. "You're going to be famous," Evelyn said softly, her words slipping under his skin like a needle. "Not for your career, not for your talent, but for the day you thought your bias, your ignorance, your cowardice would go unnoticed." Jason's jaw clenched so tightly she thought she could hear his teeth grind. Martin stepped in again, holding out his hands in a pitiful attempt at smoothing things over. "Ms. Harrington, please." "I don't want your apology," Evelyn interrupted, her voice firm, final. "I don't need your explanations. I have everything I need." The senior clerk, pale and sweating, stumbled forward with a sealed evidence bag containing the drive with the requested footage. Clarissa accepted it wordlessly and slipped it into her briefcase with the same precision one might use sealing a coffin. Evelyn stepped back, letting her gaze sweep across the lobby one final time. The tellers who had looked away, the customers who had stood frozen, the guards who had obeyed without question. They would all remember her now, not as the woman they thought they could erase, but as the woman who refused to let them forget. As she turned toward the door, a voice called out from the far side of the room, a whisper at first, then louder. "Is it true?" one of the younger tellers asked hesitantly. "Are you really?" Evelyn paused, turning slightly. "Yes," she said simply. "I am Evelyn Harrington. I am the CEO of Harrington Global Holdings. And before this day is over, every account we hold with this bank will be closed. Every dollar withdrawn. Every contract terminated." The lobby sucked in a collective breath as the reality of it hit like a hammer to glass. "And," she added, her voice dropping lower, steady as a guillotine descending, "we are not the only ones who will leave." Jason stood frozen, his world collapsing around him, and Martin looked like a man seconds from begging. Evelyn didn't give them the chance. She walked out of the lobby, Clarissa matching her step for step, the air behind them crackling with the knowledge that the reckoning had already begun. Outside, the flashing lights of a waiting media van caught the sunset, cameras already pointing at the bank entrance. Clarissa's phone buzzed twice, reporters confirming receipt of the footage. Lawsuits already drafted, press conferences scheduled. The world was already watching, and it would not look away. The next morning dawned heavy and gray, the sky sagging low over the city, as if even the weather sensed the weight of what was coming. Cameras crowded outside the glass steps of Harrington Global's headquarters, their lenses pointed expectantly at the podium set up in the courtyard. News vans lined the street like vultures waiting for a fresh carcass, their satellite dishes angled skyward, transmitting every second back to homes, offices, and newsrooms across the country. The rumor mill had worked fast overnight, faster than even Clarissa had anticipated, fueled by early leaks of the security footage and whispers from police insiders too nervous to keep silent. By 9 o'clock sharp, Evelyn stepped out of the revolving doors, her stride calm, her posture straight, her bruised cheek left uncovered for the world to see. She wore a simple black suit, no jewelry, no makeup except a thin gloss on her lips, nothing flashy or performative. Just the unshakable dignity of a woman who had nothing to hide and everything to reveal. Clarissa and several senior attorneys flanked her at a respectful distance, carrying thick folders tucked neatly under their arms. Folders containing lawsuits, evidence packets, copies of subpoenas already filed with the courts. They were not here to posture. They were here to deliver judgment. Evelyn reached the podium without rushing, letting the murmured buzz of reporters die into a heavy silence that stretched across the courtyard. Microphones clustered at the edge of the stand, their red lights blinking steadily. No one spoke. No one dared. She placed both hands lightly on either side of the podium, leaned in slightly, and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the cold morning air like a blade. "My name is Evelyn Harrington," she began, her voice smooth, steady, unhurried. "I am the CEO and majority owner of Harrington Global Holdings." She let the words settle before continuing. "Yesterday, I entered Weston Bank's downtown branch to make a routine corporate deposit on behalf of my company. I provided full identification. I provided all necessary documentation. I was not disruptive. I was not aggressive. I was not suspicious. I was simply there to do my job. The same job that has helped generate hundreds of millions of dollars currently held in accounts with Weston Bank." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of reporters, a low tide of shock and anger that built with each measured word. "I was assaulted," Evelyn continued, her voice never rising, the raw facts striking harder than any shouted accusation, "by a junior banker who refused to even look at my identification. I was physically struck across the face. I was forcibly removed by security. I was arrested by police officers who made no attempt to verify the truth of the situation. I was handcuffed, fingerprinted, and thrown into a holding cell for hours, without charge, without dignity, without the basic decency afforded to any human being." She paused, allowing the cameras to drink in the sight of her standing there. Not broken, not bowed, but radiating a strength so profound that even the winter air seemed to shudder around her. "This was not a mistake," she said, her tone sharpening just slightly. "This was the result of systemic bias, of lazy assumptions, of racism dressed up as protocol." Reporters scribbled furiously. Camera shutters clicked in a frantic rhythm. The footage, already circulating, would make it impossible for Weston Bank or the police department to spin this as anything else. The whole world could see Jason Reed slapping her. The whole world could see the officers wrenching her arms behind her back, without a single question asked. "As of this morning," Evelyn continued, "Harrington Global Holdings has terminated all financial contracts with Weston Bank. We are in the process of withdrawing all corporate funds and redirecting them to institutions whose values align with the basic principles of equity and respect." She lifted a thick stack of documents from the podium and held them up briefly. "Additionally, civil lawsuits have been filed against Weston Bank, against the individuals responsible for my assault and mistreatment, and against the officers and police department involved in my unlawful arrest." Clarissa stepped forward and handed fresh copies of the lawsuits to the waiting press. "And let me be perfectly clear," Evelyn said, her voice dipping lower, growing colder. "These lawsuits are only the beginning." The courtyard exploded with shouted questions, dozens of reporters jostling against the barricades, their voices rising over one another in a desperate clamor for more details, more anger, more vengeance. But Evelyn raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent, the authority in her gesture undeniable. "I am not here to relive my humiliation," she said. "I am not here to ask for sympathy. I am here to hold accountable those who believe they can act with impunity because of the color of my skin, because of the quietness of my voice, because of the assumptions they make when they think no one important is watching." She straightened, her eyes sweeping across the sea of faces, daring any of them to look away. "To Weston Bank," she said, each word falling with the weight of a stone into water. "To Jason Reed, to Martin Glass, to the officers who put their hands on me. Know this: the world is watching. The truth is recorded, and your actions have consequences." Without waiting for applause, without pausing for further questions, Evelyn turned from the podium and walked away, her footsteps crisp and sure against the concrete. Clarissa and the legal team fell in behind her, a procession of measured power leaving behind a media frenzy that would only grow fiercer by the hour. Inside Weston Bank's corporate offices, televisions flickered with the live broadcast. Executives sat frozen, watching their institution's name crawl across the bottom of the screen under words like discrimination, lawsuit, and corporate exodus. The phones began ringing in the background, first a trickle, then a steady flood. Investors demanding answers, clients threatening withdrawals, board members calling emergency meetings. In the police department downtown, officers clustered around monitors, faces pale as the footage played and replayed. Each slap, each rough handcuffing, each lie repeated back to them with brutal, undeniable clarity. Chief McKenna leaned heavily against the doorframe of her office, her stomach sinking deeper with every second. There would be investigations now, civil suits. Internal affairs would come crashing through the walls they had built around themselves for years. And this time, there would be no quiet deals, no whispered cover-ups. This time, the reckoning had a name: Evelyn Harrington. And she had only just begun. The city moved differently now. Where once Weston Bank's name had carried a kind of effortless prestige, a silent understanding of trust and stability, now it was a stain whispered about in boardrooms and shouted about on street corners. News anchors dissected every frame of the security footage with grim precision. Analysts debated the lawsuits on morning shows, and social media swarmed with outrage that grew sharper and more focused with each passing hour. What had begun as a local scandal was fast becoming a national reckoning, and no one inside the bank's glass towers could pretend it was anything less than catastrophic. In the executive conference room on the 22nd floor, The mood was thick with panic, barely concealed beneath brittle attempts at professionalism. The regional president, a man whose carefully cultivated career had been built on decades of avoidance and plausible deniability, wiped his forehead with a trembling hand as he stared at the stack of reports growing heavier by the minute. "We need a statement," one of the vice presidents said, her voice strained. "We need to show contrition, acknowledge the mistake, offer a settlement, not a chance." Another executive cut in sharply. "She's not here for settlements. She's here for blood." They all knew it. They could feel it in the way the story refused to die, refused to be spun into something safer, something manageable. Evelyn Harrington had not screamed or begged or made emotional appeals. She had presented facts, evidence, a bruised face, and an unbroken will that spoke louder than any apology ever could. The door opened sharply, and Martin Glass stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. He clutched a resignation letter in one hand, his briefcase in the other, the posture of a man who knew when the tide was too strong to swim against. "I'll spare you the formalities," he said quietly, dropping the letter onto the conference table with a soft slap. "I'm finished." No one tried to stop him. No one even spoke. They only watched as he turned and walked out of the room, his career already collapsing behind him like a building with its foundations ripped away. Downstairs, the atmosphere was no better. Jason Reed sat alone in the cramped Human Resources office, his face blank as the department head read through the termination paperwork in a flat, tired voice. There was no negotiation, no appeal, no ceremony, just a few clipped sentences confirming what everyone already knew, that he was fired, effective immediately, banned from setting foot in any Weston Bank property again. When it was over, he signed the papers with a hand that shook badly enough to smear the ink, then pushed back from the table and stumbled out into the lobby, the same lobby where he had struck Evelyn Harrington across the face, the same lobby where he had believed, with stupid certainty, that he could act without consequence. Now the stares that followed him were different. Not admiration, not camaraderie. Pity, disgust, fear of contamination by association. Outside, the reporters were still camped across the street, and Jason knew, with the cold, crawling certainty of a man who had lost everything, that stepping through those doors would be the end of whatever tattered shred of reputation he still thought he had. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, dropped his head, and pushed through the doors anyway. Across town, at the police department, the dominoes were beginning to fall just as quickly. Chief McKenna stood at the front of the briefing room, facing a sea of stone-faced officers who now understood, with painful clarity, that no shield, no badge, no thin blue line was going to protect them from the tide bearing down. "The officers involved in the Weston Bank arrest have been placed on immediate administrative leave," she said, her voice brittle from too many sleepless nights and phone calls from angry officials demanding answers she could no longer provide. "Internal Affairs is conducting a full investigation. Federal oversight is being considered." A low, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the room, but no one dared challenge her. Not when every news station carried images of Evelyn being dragged in handcuffs across the polished floor. Not when every community leader from the mayor to church pastors to civil rights advocates were calling for heads to roll. Outside the department's heavy glass doors, protesters had already begun to gather, their chants growing louder by the hour. Signs with Evelyn's face painted across them in bold strokes waved above the crowd. Words like "Justice for Evelyn" and "Systemic Change" now filled the air, their rhythm steady, unrelenting. Inside Harrington Global, the atmosphere was entirely different. Calm, methodical, triumphant, but without gloating. Clarissa moved through the legal division with quiet efficiency, overseeing a team of attorneys who prepared the next wave of actions: individual civil suits against the officers, petitions for public inquiries into Weston Bank's hiring practices, letters drafted to the Department of Justice requesting formal intervention into local police misconduct. Evelyn sat at the head of the conference table, a tablet in front of her displaying the live news feed. She said little. She needed to say little. The world was moving exactly as she had intended, each piece falling into place, with the inevitability of gravity. When a junior associate entered the room carrying a printout of Weston Bank's stock price, she accepted it silently, scanning the numbers. It had fallen 6% in 24 hours. Analysts were predicting a free fall if client withdrawals continued at their current rate. Board members were already leaking dissatisfaction to the press, framing themselves as shocked by the isolated incident, trying desperately to salvage their own futures. The city's skyline loomed gray and heavy against the horizon as Evelyn sat in the private conference room on the top floor of Weston Bank's headquarters, the glass walls offering a sweeping view of the streets far below, where protesters still marched, their signs bobbing steadily with each chant. She sat alone at the long, polished table for several minutes, her hands folded neatly in front of her, unhurried, unmoved by the tension crackling just beyond the heavy oak doors. She had made them wait, not out of arrogance, but to remind them that they no longer controlled the tempo of this conversation. At last, the door opened, and a cluster of executives filed in. Stiff, pale, their movements clipped with a mixture of fear and forced professionalism. The regional president, a thin man whose expensive suit could not mask the desperation in his eyes, led the way, flanked by the bank's lead counsel and two senior board members. They looked like men approaching a funeral they could not postpone. "Ms. Harrington," the president began, his voice polished but hollow, "we appreciate you agreeing to meet. We deeply regret what occurred at our branch." And Evelyn raised a hand, a simple gesture that silenced him mid-sentence. She let the quiet stretch for a few heartbeats longer than necessary, feeling the weight of their discomfort fill the room. "I am not here for your regret," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "Regret is easy. Regret is worthless. I am here for commitments. I am here for guarantees." The executives exchanged nervous glances. The lead counsel shifted a thick folder onto the table and opened it, revealing a printed apology statement, drafts of proposed reforms, and a preliminary settlement offer that Evelyn did not so much as glance at. "You have a systemic problem," Evelyn continued, her tone measured but leaving no room for misinterpretation. "It is not limited to one employee, one branch, or one incident. It is embedded in the assumptions your employees are allowed to make about who is worthy of respect and who is not." The president cleared his throat softly. "We are prepared to implement new training initiatives across all branches, effective immediately. Bias training, cultural sensitivity." "Not enough," Evelyn said simply, leaning forward slightly, her presence filling the space in a way no shouting ever could. "Training alone is meaningless without accountability. I want leadership-level participation. Every executive, every board member, every senior manager. Not optional, mandatory. Certified by an independent organization. I approve." The president hesitated, glancing at his colleagues for support that would not come. The lead counsel nodded tightly, scribbling notes. "And," Evelyn said, her voice dropping lower, colder, "Jason Reed." The president stiffened, bracing for the demand he knew was coming, but hoping somehow to negotiate softer terms. "He has already been terminated," he said quickly. "Effective immediately." Not enough," Evelyn interrupted again, her tone sharper now, the patience in her voice thinning. "Termination is the beginning, not the end." The room grew even tenser, if possible, the air brittle with the sharp, invisible weight of coming judgment. "I want a formal letter issued to every major financial institution and regulatory body, stating that Jason Reed is unfit for employment in any client-facing role in the banking industry," Evelyn said, each word slow and deliberate. "I want him barred from ever holding a position of authority over customer accounts again." The lead counsel paled visibly. "Ms. Harrington," he began carefully, Blacklisting an individual, not blacklisting, Evelyn corrected smoothly. Transparency. Full disclosure. Let the industry decide if they want to risk employing someone whose instincts led to assault, racial profiling, and the near destruction of their institution's public trust. The president opened his mouth as if to argue, but the glances from the board members beside him silenced whatever protest he had prepared. They understood, even if he did not, that they were no longer negotiating from a place of strength. Evelyn allowed the silence to stretch again, her gaze steady, unflinching. "And your training reforms," she said after a moment, her voice returning to that low, cutting steadiness. "You will make the curriculum public. You will certify completion annually. And you will tie executive bonuses to compliance for the next 5 years. Miss the mark, lose the money." The lead counsel's pen scratched feverishly across the page, trying to keep up. "Do these terms meet your understanding of accountability?" Evelyn asked, her eyebrows lifting slightly in a gesture that was almost, but not quite, a dare. The president swallowed, his voice faint when he finally spoke. "Yes, Miss Harrington." "Good," Evelyn said, leaning back slightly in her chair. "Then you will prepare the documents. You will sign them, and you will announce these changes publicly, before the close of business tomorrow." The executives nodded. Beaten men, their illusions of control shattered under the relentless, patient pressure of a woman who had refused to be broken. As they gathered their papers and murmured their hollow thanks, Evelyn rose, smoothing her jacket with a quiet precision that carried more power than any outburst could have. She turned without another word and walked out of the conference room, Clarissa falling into step beside her. Silent but triumphant, the elevators whisked them down toward the lobby, where the first hints of evening shadow stretched across the marble floors. Outside, the protesters were still there, their chants steady and rhythmic, and Evelyn paused for a moment to watch them through the glass. "This is just the beginning," Clarissa said quietly at her side. Evelyn nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. "Good," she said, her voice soft but full of iron. "Let them feel it." And as the doors slid open and the cold evening air spilled in, Evelyn Harrington stepped forward into a world that was already shifting under her steady, relentless hand. The city's cold air pressed heavy against the sidewalks as Evelyn stepped out of the car and faced the looming gray stone of the downtown police headquarters. The building, with its heavy iron doors and narrow, reinforced windows, projected the kind of authority that had long mistaken silence for strength, obedience for justice. But today, it would be forced to listen. Clarissa walked a few paces behind her, carrying a slim leather folio tucked neatly under one arm, filled with documents prepared not as threats, but as certainties. Evelyn did not rush. She climbed the wide front steps with the same measured pace she had carried into Weston Bank's boardroom, her heels clicking against the worn stone, her presence alone forcing 2 uniformed officers at the entrance to straighten reflexively, their easy arrogance faltering as they recognized her face. Inside, the lobby buzzed with muted conversations and the low, persistent hum of printers and radios. Officers moved through the space with stiff movements, avoiding her gaze as they passed. The news had spread fast. They all knew who she was now. They all knew what had happened. And they knew that this time there would be no shielding behind badges and procedure. The receptionist, a young woman with nervous eyes, swallowed hard when Evelyn approached and managed a tight, mechanical greeting. "I'm here for Chief McKenna," Evelyn said calmly, her voice slicing cleanly through the buzzing tension in the air. "She is expecting me." The woman nodded quickly and picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed. A brief, whispered conversation later, Evelyn was escorted through a side door and down a long corridor that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. Chief Laura McKenna waited behind a heavy oak desk in her office, the blinds drawn tightly shut against the windows, her posture rigid in her high-backed chair. She rose when Evelyn entered, extending a hand that Evelyn ignored without hesitation, moving instead to the seat across from the desk, lowering herself into it with the quiet control of someone who knew exactly how much ground she already owned. Clarissa sat beside her, pulling the folio open without fanfare and setting a crisp packet of documents on the edge of the desk between them. Chief McKenna hesitated, then lowered herself back into her chair, her face carefully composed, but unable to hide the strain around her eyes. She cleared her throat once, a dry, brittle sound, and tried to speak with authority that no longer had weight. "Ms. Harrington," she began, her voice low and formal, "I want to extend my deepest apologies for the—" "No," Evelyn said, not harshly, not loudly, but with a finality that left no room for misunderstanding. "I am not here for apologies. I am here for accountability." The words landed hard. McKenna's mouth pressed into a tight, colorless line. "You dispatched officers who made no effort to assess the situation," Evelyn said, her voice even, deliberate. "You authorized arrests based solely on the accusations of a bank employee who had not verified a single piece of identification, had not verified a single fact. Your officers did not ask questions. They did not request evidence. They handcuffed me, humiliated me, and dragged me through a public space like a criminal." McKenna shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Evelyn pressed on, her gaze steady and unrelenting. "They did not verify my name. They did not verify my ownership of the accounts in question. They did not so much as glance at the surveillance cameras installed every 10 feet inside the building they were summoned to." Evelyn continued, each fact delivered cleanly, methodically, the indictment stacking higher with every word. "They simply acted, because the accusation came from someone who looked like they belonged, and I, in their eyes, did not." The chief's hands, clasped tightly together on the desk, trembled almost imperceptibly. She opened her mouth again, but Evelyn lifted a hand, the smallest of gestures that nonetheless silenced the room completely. "I want the officers responsible for my arrest formally disciplined," Evelyn said, her tone sharpened now, carrying the unmistakable gravity of a woman who had not come to negotiate, but to enforce. "Publicly, transparently. I want their names released. I want the disciplinary actions entered into their permanent records." McKenna inhaled through her nose, the tension in her posture pulling tighter, but she nodded, a short, shallow motion that betrayed how little choice she had left. "You will also issue a formal statement," Evelyn continued, "not an apology wrapped in excuses, a statement accepting full responsibility for the unlawful arrest, a statement acknowledging the role that racial bias played in the officer's actions." Across the desk, the chief's knuckles whitened, her pride bleeding out onto the wood grain as she nodded again, slower this time, defeated. "And," Clarissa added smoothly, sliding another document across the desk, "you will implement mandatory bias and de-escalation training for every sworn officer, with annual certifications monitored by an independent review board. Ms. Harrington will approve the organization providing the training." McKenna picked up the document with stiff fingers, skimming the terms she had no realistic hope of refusing. Evelyn watched her, feeling no triumph, no pleasure. This was not about personal satisfaction. This was about creating a consequence strong enough that no officer could ever again pretend ignorance was a shield. No chief could ever again claim surprise when the system they built failed the people it was sworn to protect. "You built a culture where assumptions were treated as facts," Evelyn said quietly, her voice low enough that McKenna had to strain to catch every word. "Where race dictated guilt and appearances dictated truth. That culture ends today, or it will end with you." The room hung in silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. Finally, McKenna set the documents back on the desk with shaking hands and looked at Evelyn properly for the first time since she entered. "We will comply," she said, her voice ragged but firm. "You have my word." Evelyn said nothing in return. She did not need her word. She had her signature. her office's cooperation, and the full weight of public scrutiny pressing down on every decision from this moment forward. She rose from her chair, gathered the signed documents Clarissa handed her, and turned without another word, her steps steady, deliberate, her back straight as a blade. The doors swung open ahead of her, and Evelyn Harrington stepped out into the bright white corridors of the station, leaving behind a crumbling wall of denial and carrying forward a victory that would not stop at a single correction. It would rip through the foundations of everything that had allowed her arrest to happen in the first place. The city had shifted beneath her feet, and Evelyn Harrington could feel it with every quiet breath she took as she sat alone in the corner office of her headquarters, the evening light spilling across the polished wood and soft leather with a muted glow. The storm she had unleashed no longer raged in wild chaos. It moved with purpose now, cutting paths through institutions that had once thought themselves untouchable, reshaping a landscape that had been designed for silence, for dismissal, for quiet suffering behind closed doors. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the armrests. Her gaze turned out toward the skyline, where the first few windows of office towers had already begun to blink dark as night approached. In the past week, Weston Bank had seen a mass exodus of corporate clients, each one issuing carefully worded statements about reviewing relationships and reaffirming commitments to equity, their real motives as transparent as the glass walls they worked behind. Investor calls had been leaked to the press, furious voices demanding leadership changes, deeper audits, public house cleanings. The stock price continued its slow descent, a visible, measurable consequence of arrogance and rot exposed too late to hide. Jason Reed's name had been circulated in formal industry notices, as she had demanded. His termination letter, including the details of his misconduct, was attached to every internal job posting and background verification system used by banks across the country. No major institution would touch him now. No polite euphemisms, no whispered favors would erase the public record Evelyn had carved into stone. Martin Glass's resignation, once a desperate attempt to outrun responsibility, had collapsed into public disgrace when reporters dug into his record, unearthing a long history of quietly settled complaints and overlooked misconduct. His reputation was in tatters, his future in finance reduced to ash. The police department had fared no better. The two officers who arrested her without question had been formally suspended pending investigation, their names dragged into every nightly broadcast, their photos plastered across screens with the sharp, merciless precision of justice too long delayed. Internal Affairs had launched a wider probe into past complaints, uncovering patterns that had been hidden under bureaucratic dust for years. Chief McKenna, though still clinging to her position for now, faced mounting pressure from city leaders who no longer saw her as a shield, but as a liability waiting to explode under scrutiny. Evelyn's reforms were not just promises spoken into microphones. They were being written into contracts, etched into operational policies, tied to salaries and advancement in ways that could not be undone without consequences sharper than any fine or public apology. It was slow work, grinding and methodical, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Evelyn allowed herself to believe it might not just be survival this time. It might be change. She turned from the window and reached for the thick file sitting neatly on the corner of her desk. Inside were the next steps: settlement negotiations with Weston Bank on terms she would dictate, public oversight committee appointments she would recommend to city leadership, scholarship initiatives funded by redirected donations from the fines and settlements she was extracting. She opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages with a quiet, grim satisfaction. This was the work no one applauded. The slow stitching closed of wounds left open for generations, but it was the work that mattered most. Her phone buzzed once against the desk, a message from Clarissa flashing across the screen. confirmation that the city's mayor had agreed to publicly support the police reform bill Evelyn's team had drafted. Another stone in the foundation of something stronger than what had come before. She let the phone fall silent and sat back once more, her hands folding lightly over her stomach, her mind drifting not to the men who had tried to humiliate her, not to the systems that had hoped to erase her voice with steel cuffs and silent hallways, but to the long, unbroken line of strength that had carried her here. Her mother's voice urging dignity over despair, her father's steady hands teaching her to stand taller when the world tried to shrink her, the countless faces she would never meet, who needed to know that someone had fought back and refused to be silenced. Justice was not a single act, a single lawsuit, a single victory. It was a long road paved one stone at a time, each one laid by hands that had refused to be turned away. She would keep building. She would keep fighting. And no one would ever mistake her silence for surrender again. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the city, painting the skyline in strokes of amber and soft gold, the light catching on the smooth glass towers that had, for so long, symbolized untouchable power. Evelyn sat on the quiet terrace outside her office, a heavy knit shawl draped over her shoulders, a cup of coffee cooling slowly in her hands. The air was crisp, but not unfriendly, the kind of air that carried a promise rather than a threat. Clarissa sat opposite her, legs crossed, a tablet balanced on her lap, though she wasn't looking at it now. They had spent the morning reviewing final settlements, drafting public announcements, coordinating the last waves of withdrawals from Weston Bank's corporate accounts. The work was nearly done. The damage had been dealt, and though the wounds to the institutions were still fresh, Evelyn knew they would leave scars deep enough to change the way they moved forever. But it wasn't just about broken careers and shaken stock prices. It had never been. Clarissa broke the quiet first, her voice low and thoughtful. "You could have taken the settlements quietly," she said. "You could have walked away after the lawsuits hit. Nobody would have blamed you." Evelyn smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. She set the coffee cup down on the small table between them and laced her fingers together, staring out over the rooftops, where the last of the protest signs still waved like stubborn reminders against the evening wind. "I wasn't interested in quiet," she said simply. "Quiet is what got us here." Clarissa nodded slowly, saying nothing, letting the weight of the words stretch between them. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, feeling the stiffness in her joints, the kind of ache that came not from defeat, but from carrying a load long enough to leave a mark. She looked down at her hands, the fine network of lines tracing the years spent building, fighting, enduring, and she thought of how easy it would have been to disappear behind a settlement check and let the machine continue grinding forward, unchallenged, unchanged. "I wanted them to say it out loud," Evelyn continued, her voice softer now. "Not just to me, to everyone. I wanted them to look at the cameras and the reporters and the shareholders and admit that they didn't see me, that they didn't think someone like me could walk into their bank with a right to be there. I wanted them to say it, so there would be no more pretending." Clarissa tapped the tablet absently, scrolling through the headlines she already knew by heart. Stories of resignations, investigations, reforms pushed through under the weight of public pressure. No apology could quiet. "You made them say it," Clarissa said. Evelyn exhaled slowly, the breath carrying away some of the heaviness, but leaving behind a quiet certainty. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe it'll make them think twice next time. Maybe it'll make the next Evelyn Harrington's walk into a bank a little easier." She let the thought settle for a moment before speaking again, her voice steady, but touched by something almost tender. "I hope one day it stops," she said. "I hope one day a woman like me doesn't have to carry the burden of proving she belongs, doesn't have to steel herself every time she steps into a room where her presence alone is treated like a question." Clarissa smiled, a small, tired smile that understood more than words could express. "It's a good hope," she said. Evelyn nodded once, slow and deliberate. "It's more than hope," she said. "It's a fight, and it's not finished." They sat there as the sun sank lower, the first stars pricking the soft blue of the evening sky, the city moving quietly around them, slower now, changed in ways small and large. Somewhere down the street, a young black girl crossed a sidewalk alone, her head high, her step steady, unaware of the battle fought for her long before she would ever know it was necessary. Evelyn smiled to herself, not the smile of a woman satisfied with revenge, but the smile of someone who had added one more stone to a road that stretched beyond her lifetime. She picked up her coffee again, warming her fingers around the cup, and leaned back against the chair, letting the cool evening breeze carry her words into the gathering night. "We're not invisible anymore," she said quietly. "And we're not asking permission." Clarissa raised her cup in a silent toast, and Evelyn clinked hers gently against it, the soft sound folding into the dusk as the city lights flickered on, one by one, against the dark. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.